Now, Inge, you can explain more about the Nordic model, please. Thank you.
I will do so. But first of all, thank you very much, Lea, for your kind words. And just to give you a short impression, well, I'm not a journalist anymore, but I used to work almost 15 years for the first German television for ARD as a journalist with the focus on the political, social, and economic development in Southeastern Europe. And it was the time after the Iron Curtain came down and later on after the Kosovo War. And as you know, these countries in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, were reform countries, post-socialist countries, with all these big problems which persist until today. So organized crime, prostitution, human trafficking. And as we all know, since the EU accession of Romania and Bulgaria, what we face now in Germany is that most of the women in prostitution are from these countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and when Sister Lea started her help program in Kenya back in the 80s, 85, I think you founded the first Solvodi, Solidarity with Women in Distress organization in Kenya. By that time, you focused on the sex tourism in these countries, but then you came back to Germany, and after 89, the wall came down, and you witnessed all this influx of the Eastern European countries into Germany, into prostitution, all the Polish, the Czech, the Russian, and then later on the Romanian and Bulgarian women and very young women and girls who flooded literally the prostitution scene. And so you started Solvodi also in Germany. And I think we have right now almost 20 special advisory centers and shelters in Germany and also in Hungary, in Romania, and of course the big organization which persists since 85 in Kenya, with what you said, Solvidi, the follow-up organization for the girls victims of trafficking. And this is a life achievement, Schwester Lea, and thank you very much for this. And we came across, we met when I was still this reporter back in 1999 when the Kosovo War took place, and I was a reporter a war reporter in the Kosovo War, and I came across a topic which never left me until today. This is trafficking with children, with underage, with with children, for the purpose of sexual exploitation by soldiers, by United Nations soldiers, by KFOR, Kosovo Force peacekeeping troops. I mean, the bombings in Kosovo had just been over, like in 1999 and 2000, and international peacekeeping troops, thousands of United Nations soldiers, were all over the Balkans to stabilize the region and to defend human rights and peace. But instead of defending human rights, these soldiers would abuse them. These soldiers would buy sex services of underage girls, raped and forced to prostitute themselves. They were collected all over Eastern Europe and brought to Macedonia, to Kosovo, and to the surrounding countries in order to satisfy the needs of the soldiers. And of course, I was deeply shocked at that very moment. But what I did is I did not only report about it, but I also went like freeing women from these jails, because they were jailed into these brothels. They could not go out. There were iron bars in front of the windows. And what we did as journalists, we did not only report, but we wanted to help them, these women and underage girls. And that's why Schwester Lea and I met, because on the long run, I could free some women out of these brothels and bring them to Solvodi, back to Germany. And what I want to say is that, I'm not a journalist anymore, but when I was a journalist, it could have been absolutely sufficient and very honorable to just make this investigative documentary about this horrific human trafficking scandal, peacekeeping soldiers and underage forced prostitutes. Wow, this is sex and crime. What a story, what a scoop. Yeah? Lots of journalists would have dreamt of such an opportunity. But yes, of course, I did this investigative TV report, and it became a huge sensation, and it took everybody up, society, politicians, human rights organizations, and of course also the peacekeeping troops, the German soldiers. It was not only the German soldiers, it were Austrian soldiers, American soldiers from France, from England, from all over the world. And today it is a known fact that peacekeeping soldiers are often involved in human trafficking or human rights abuse. And raising awareness as well as educating among the troops is standard now, or should be at least. But sadly enough, these human rights abuses by United Nations soldiers still happen today. And I did not want just to report about it. I felt that I could act because when I came across these children, I wanted to change the world of these children a little bit for the better. And I would also start raising awareness campaigns about the big business of human trafficking with my capabilities. So I started then to establish several humanitarian aid programs for these girls. I was a journalist and I had a lot of contacts and with people and organizations. And so I started humanitarian work. And some of the programs are still running until today. I wrote and write books on human rights violation. I deliver speeches as today. I hold seminars and I teach on human rights at the university. And so now so it's now 20 years later, and I still fight against human trafficking and prostitution. And sometimes it seems to me that nothing changes. But then I see a lot of things changed, because when I started like 20 years ago, there was no Honeyball report. There was no EU parliamentary resolution like since 2014, when they said, well, prostitution is really harmful and please stop, demand, and please. The recommendation is please introduce in the legislation in the European Union countries, introduce the Nordic model. The Nordic model, which is since 20 years in action in Sweden, then later on in Norway, in Iceland, in Ireland, in Canada, in France, and now recently in Israel. And as far as I know, Spain is also preparing laws in order to introduce the Nordic model. And now I come to the point. The Nordic model is about decriminalizing the prostitutes, but criminalizing the Johns, so the buyers of this, I really hate to say the word, of these sex services, because it's not a service and it is not sex. It is rape, and it can never be a service because prostitution can never be a job. Yeah? So, but the basic thing is helping, basic thing of Nordic model as Sweden introduced it is decriminalizing women and girls in prostitution, helping them out of prostitution, criminalizing the buyers, so stop the demand by criminalizing the buyers. It's also really sensitization, awareness raising in the society. And it's this awareness raising in society starts very early, already in school or in kindergarten, that is absolutely forbidden that one sex buys the other sex, that men buy women, that men can buy the access to the bodies of women and children, and this is a legal law for them. So this is absolutely a no-go, but this is still the case in Germany. Yeah? So first of all, decriminalize prostitutes or women in prostitution, criminalize the buyers, awareness raising for the society, real help for the women in prostitution, and no such helping cosmetics, as I always say. It has to be real help for them, real support, and starting at an early age. And the absolute conviction or the commitment to the sentence that prostitution is can never be on one step with gender equality. Prostitution is the contrary of gender equality, because prostitution is violence against women and girls. So, which was a very revolutionary act by then in Sweden, is now agreed by most of the Swedish population. If you go on to Sweden and you ask people in Sweden, what do you think about prostitution? Most of them would say, prostitution? no, this is not in accordance with gender equality. No, this is not in accordance with dignity, with human dignity. No, this can never be a job. Oh my God. And someone who buys the sexual services of a woman in prostitution, he's seen as like a drug addict or a loser. So he's seen very strange person. Yeah? This is 20 years later in Sweden. Huh? And when we look at Germany, who chose 20 years ago the other way, the way to legalize prostitution, to have a liberal thought on this, to think, okay, we might get the women out of the stigma, of the stigmatization, when we introduce a more liberal law and we do like some regulatory things in our legislation. But now when you ask someone here in Germany on the street, what do you think about prostitution? Then you would have the answer, well, prostitution, oh, that's cool. Well, it's just sex work. And if they choose to do it voluntarily, that's just cool. So, which is really sad, because what happened in Germany is now that the whole world is looking upon Germany like we look into America, into the US legislation on arms, on weapons. Yeah, we really think, oh my God, weapons are legalized there, and one can have weapons and arms. So, and we think, oh my God, how is this possible? And the whole world looks on Germany and says, my God, how is this possible? They legalized prostitution and all the women are sexually exploited. And you literally see what happened with this Eastern Europe thing, that all the young Bulgarian and Romanian women and girls come over to Germany and flood the prostitution market there and are exploited. They are not workers. They're just exploited. They are victims of violence. And oh my God, what is Germany doing here? Yeah? So we are looked upon like the brothel of Europe, and Germany as the brothel of Europe. Germany should be a lighthouse. It should send out a signal against prostitution, against exploitation, and against violence against women in prostitution. But it is not yet. So, but what I can tell you, what is, I said before that I witnessed 20 years of, well, slow change, but I'm really very happy to tell you that about 1 month ago, in Germany was founded a bigger alliance, an alliance Nordic model, in which unite now more than 30 organizations. Among them, of course, big organizations like Solvodi, like Sisters, which is represented by Sandra here in this panel, and also by Terre de Femmes, which is my organization where I'm the vice president. So it's not only the big organizations with shelters and women's rights, but it's also the grassroots initiatives. So, and also church, the Katholische Deutsche Frauenbund, the Catholic Alliance, German Women's Alliance, is also within this alliance for the Nordic model. So we have this broader alliance now with hundreds and thousands of members, which advocate for the Nordic model. And it has to have a joint approach towards the politicians in order to change this absurd legislation, and a legislation which is simply laughed at, for example, by the countries of the Nordic model. Yeah, well, it's not laughed at, but it's seen with a tear in the eyes, because it's so anti-humanistic. Yeah, it's so anti-humanistic. So with one word, we have failed in Germany with our legislation of liberalizing and regulating prostitution. And we made hundreds of thousands of girls and women victims of violence by this legislation. And it's high time now to change the view, to change the perspective on prostitution as to that what it is. It's pure and simply violence against women. And we cannot support a system which is doing harm to thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s women and children in prostitution. We must change the system, helping the victims, criminalizing the Johns who create this demand, yeah, and really awareness raising among the population. And as the end of my talk, I would like to give indeed as cynical as it may sound, but I want to give the voice to 3 Johns. I'm quoting now from the Ellie Arrow. Ellie Arrow is one of the human rights activists, which is also in the Alliance for the Nordic Model. She collects quotes from Johns, and I would really like to give a quotation to one of the Johns. So let me see where it is. One moment. Here it is. I booked this animal once. So what I quote is from an internet forum, because in Germany you can easily access brothels or women in prostitution by the internet. There are lots of forums where the Johns can write about their experiences or about the women and girls. So I booked this animal once. Her apartment stinks of cat piss. Also, the bed was broken. And the so-called execution mattress is so fluffy that you can catch all kinds of things. She wasn't shaven, even though I demanded that. Further, she kept trying to get me to pay extra and had to keep consulting her boyfriend or her pimp. So one German sex buyer or John who wrote in one forum. I have another one. You got young women from Hungary, sometimes so thinly clothed that it amounts to Christian charity to take them inside and warm them up with your body for half an hour or so. The beds are a catastrophe. You can see a trace of the previous guy's sperm. You can imagine that you're just picking up a young girl, which is neat. And the third voice. Is a whore just a piece of is a whore just a piece of fuck meat, or does one have to show respect? I've been wondering if my approach is the rule. To me, a whore is just a thing that's there to satisfy me. I do my part by paying. Now, I've noticed that especially hobby whores have been getting more bitchy and annoying while asking for more and more cash. Have any of you noticed the same? So with this quote, you can easily see that when there is a purchasing act of so-called sex services, then there is no eye level with a human being, with a woman or with a girl. It is just a thing. It's just an object. So therefore, prostitution can never be a job when there is no human being doing this job, but a thing, a robot, an object. Yeah. So I want to close my talk with this. Germany, and not only Germany, the whole European Union has to introduce the Nordic model, because all the models until today, abolition models, so criminalizing prostitutes and liberalizing or regulating the prostitution, have failed. So the Nordic model is the only leftover chance to get gender equality and human rights for women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge. What can I say? The whole cruelty of what's going on was just described, not by you, but by the sex buyers themselves, you know. So that speaks for itself. That is, thank you very much for this comprehensive insights. So I will go and read more. There are also questions now. For example, I once read that sexual services are the oldest profession in the world. Would you agree with this statement? And if this is the case, what is the prognosis of addressing demand? How difficult is it to address demand if it was supposedly always there? So could you just comment on this? A question about the language you are using. And maybe that is one of the things the public needs to be more educated about. I was recently told by a person running an advice center for women working in prostitution in my city, to please avoid the word prostitution as it is demeaning. Instead, she advised me to use the words like sexual or sex workers. Now, I hear a very difficult language here. In your view, what would be an appropriate language to use to talk about this? What would be a language that would help to raise awareness?
Maybe I can add to this as well. So just a short, and then you, Brian. What my best practice is, meanwhile, I try not to speak about prostitutes, but about women and girls in prostitution, because they're human beings, women and girls in prostitution, and prostitution is the system. So they're not prostitutes, they're not characterized by the system. They happen to be in that form of sexual exploitation, which is called prostitution. So women and girls in prostitution. And then there's this other aspect, sex work. I would never use this as well. Neither sex nor work. What I always find very interesting is, for example, one other woman who was a survivor of prostitution. She always says, when sex should be something very joyful and lustful, and for this mutual satisfaction of the people, and as soon as there's no consent, so when there's consent, then it is sex, okay? But when there's no consent, or when the consent has to be paid, then it turns into no consent, but just a paid consent. But paid consent is no consent to sex. It's the consent to the money. It's the yes to the money. It's not the yes to the sex. And a no to the sex is a rape. So it cannot be sex work. It's rape. And then the third thing, which I always say when it comes to these terminologies, is, okay, we in Germany, we have 3 words for example, Sexarbeit, Sklavenarbeit, Zwangsarbeit. So forced labor, slavery labor, and sex work. But it is not work. I mean, you would never say to slavery that it's slavery work. Yeah, it's slavery. You would never say to forced labor in the Nazi regime, for example. You would never say it's work. Yeah, it was slavery. It was forced. So this is the same: prostitution, sex slavery, slavery, and forced labor.
I'm already looking at the time, but I have one question here, and maybe everybody of you could say one short opinion on this. And this is the real golden question. Of course, reduce the number of buyers buying, but how? You know, so we hear a lot about it, and many agencies are talking about demand. But I still have to get the golden formula of how to tackle demand. What would you say, Inge? Yeah.
Me first? Okay. Well, as Albert Schweitzer once said, even the little what you can do help. Even the small steps help. I only know the German saying, it's das wenige, was du tun kannst, ist viel. Even the small steps help. So what you can do is very practical. First of all, you can write to your politicians. I mean, hopefully you're living in a democracy. So go and talk to your politicians and say, no, we don't want this to happen in our country, because prostitution is not gender equality, will always hamper gender equality, will always contradict gender equality, and is always violence against women and girls. So go and talk to your politicians. I mean, go and look for where you can unite, and where you can approach, not as an individual, but as a group to raise your voice. Go and speak to the media. support the NGOs who are doing all this grassroots work, like, for example, Solvodi, the organizations which do provide shelters, and support the local organizations you certainly have in each and every country, like where Sandra is putting her effort and her power into, like Sisters. So survivors of prostitution, survivors of human trafficking, they need help. I mean, they need, as Sandra pointed it out, I mean, you go out of the prostitution system, of the exploitation physically, but you still are heavily burdened with psychological issues. So these people need help, and raise awareness about the topic in your families, within your friends and acquaintances. So speak about the topic, yeah, and in order that it comes out of this oh la la taboo zone, yeah, prostitution, oh my God, voluntarily work. So there's a lot you can do, yeah, raising awareness in your field, in your friends, families, and so on, politicians, shelters, organizations, whole bunch of things.